Actively managing your personal brand is critical if you want to make a significant impact in the areas of your life important to you. I've spent most of my life working in the world of branding products. More recently, I've been exploring the world of personal branding and wrote a book on this, Brand New, Brand You. And the podcast has come out of this as a way to share first-hand experiences from some of Australia's most recognised personal brands. The Honorary Arthur Sinodinos AO, a partner and chair of the Asia Group Australian practice, and a leading expert on Australian public policy and politics, who brings a wealth of public and private sector experience spanning national security, industry innovation, economic policy and banking. Ambassador Sinodinos is responsible for developing and executing the firm's business strategy in Australia and supporting C-suite executives from across the Asia Group's geographic portfolio to manage evolving risks and seizing emerging growth opportunities. Ambassador Sinodinos most recently served as Australian Ambassador to the United States, where he was closely involved in Australia's negotiations related to AUKUS, the Quad, and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Arthur, thank you so much for the privilege to sit and talk to you today.
Always good to see you, Garry.
We have been interacting and talking and meeting. I was only thinking this morning, probably for at least 2 decades.
Yes.
And I think the first occasion and opportunity I had of meeting you was actually at a luncheon where we were listening to your wisdom as the Chief of Staff for the Prime Minister at a private luncheon in Canberra. Over that period of time, I've always known you to be a person of integrity, a person who is very consistent in the way in which you interact, and we've always had a good conversation. And I think that goes back to how people perceive themselves and how they perceive others, which I guess when I talk about personal branding is the question of, do you see yourself as a brand? Do you spend time trying to make sure that you are perceived consistently and with the way in which you want to perceive yourself?
Thanks, Garry. For a long time, I didn't see myself as a brand, but as I sort of progressed in my career, I found myself in situations where I was, for example, having to perform more publicly. You referred there to speaking at a lunch. I also, as Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, became better known in the media and in parts of the community. And so I was also doing more public work, had more public exposure, and that made me more conscious that I was sort of, in a sense, becoming a brand. And then when I went to the private sector after finishing in government in 2006, I became more conscious there that people had certain perceptions of me, of what I was about. And it came through in the questions I asked about what they wanted me to do or what they were interested in knowing from me. So I began to get a feeling that they see me in a certain way, and then I realized that's the brand that they see. Since I haven't consciously set out to say, well, this is the brand and this is how I'm going to market it, because I'm slightly uncomfortable with the idea that you do this consciously, because authenticity is important in these things. And people always, I think, will find you out in the end if you're something you're not. So what I've tried to do is build on what I've been best known for, and seek to sort of do that as effectively as possible. In my case, probably the role of the trusted advisor, someone that people feel they can talk to, who can be a sounding board, who can be discreet, and who ultimately has their best interests at heart. I remember I had a mentee in politics I was talking to one day, and she said to me, yeah, I trust you because I think you've got my best interests at heart. That's the sort of brand I guess I see, I wrestle with. look, all of us are human beings. We have our strengths and weaknesses, our successes, our failures. But particularly now that I've left government again after being ambassador, and in this role with the Asia Group that you mentioned before, I'm ever more conscious of living up to the brand that's been created. I'm comfortable with the brand because I think it's me, but I'm conscious that I have to live up to that brand, particularly when I'm working for others or representing others, as in this case, the Asia Group.
So if I take it a little bit further, you've had some incredibly senior roles and leadership positions. The positions you've had could easily have been tied up in your identity, but you've managed to be able to separate that with you as a person as opposed to the position you hold. Have you given any thought to how that actually happens, how you made sure you could evolve? Because when you do a job to the highest level and to the best of your ability, you tend to own it. You tend to want to make sure it happens, and you tend to live it. How can you give us some understanding of how you have been able to move to the different roles and do it in a way that appears to be seamless?
I think every role leaves something with you. And having done the Chief of Staff role for 9 years, I think particularly left a stamp on me. And I think it probably subtly influenced me in a lot of ways that maybe even I wasn't aware of, about how I carry myself or how I relate to others. But in many of these roles, I was conscious that I didn't necessarily have power in my own right. In the case of a Chief of Staff role, you're an extension of your boss in many ways. And if you have their confidence, others will listen to you because they see you as speaking on behalf of your boss. But in many of these roles, I didn't have that much power myself. So it wasn't as if I was giving up that much power. In other words, I'd been used to exercising power in a more indirect way rather than a direct way by saying I have these levers to pull, they're only my levers to pull. So I actually found the transition into different jobs not as hard as maybe some people think. The thing I was always keen on was whatever job I did, not only to be as good at it as I could be, but there'd be a job where I feel like I'm contributing to something and I'm relevant. I think the thing that, particularly being in the Chief of Staff role, taught me is I should go for things where I really am doing something that can make a difference. And that's part of the reason I took the ambassadorship, for example. I saw that role as doing that. In the sort of roles in the private sector that I've had, the approach I took was I was going to make a difference for the people I was working with or working for. But I've never had sort of tickets on myself to the point where I have to keep relating myself today to whatever positions I've held in the past. But to some extent, I've been lucky too, because the brand has sort of carried me through. So it's not as if I have to keep sort of saying to people, well, I used to be important and, I'm really good and all the rest of it. The brand has sort of carried me through as well, if that makes sense.
It does, and it leads me to the question or the topic of reputation. And reputation's something we build up over time, but can be lost in a moment.
Very easily, yeah.
That all ties up into exactly what you've been talking about, the brand and you being the go-to person for advice and confidence, sharing, etc. So when did reputation come to in your mind as being important? Something when you were young, or?
I think, no, it became important to me when there were periods when I thought I'd lost it.
Interesting.
So, for example, I got embroiled in 2 ICAC investigations here in New South Wales. It was a very difficult time. All sorts of allegations were being made. Nothing specific was actually being alleged against me, but I was caught up in this miasma of stuff, and it was at a time when ICAC, I think, was at the height of its powers because of what had gone on before with the OBEIDs and everything else. And so for me, this was a period when all of a sudden I felt like the sort of ground was shifting from under me, and I was feeling like, gee, everything I've worked for, have I sort of thrown this away, or will it be taken away from me? And I felt like I'm not the Arthur Sinodinos I thought I was. And that was a shock to the system. And look, I handled that like I handled everything else, which is you put your head down and you work your way through it. You take advice and strategize about how best to approach things. And I got through it, but it was a time when reputation really came into focus for me. I hadn't thought of it that much before because I'd taken it for granted. But then when it looks like it's being taken away from you, all of a sudden you say, oh, how did I rebuild my reputation? Partly by surviving, by nothing coming out of those inquiries that was adverse, but also I sort of dug into my political activities because I was a senator then. I was lucky I was a senator when all this happened because I still had a job. If you're in the private sector and something like this happens to you, you often lose your job and you're really vulnerable. I was lucky I was a senator. I rebuilt my career, my reputation by just getting on with my work in politics. I became a minister under Malcolm Turnbull, a cabinet minister, cabinet secretary, and then industry minister. And all of that helped me work my way back. And then I had the cancer episode in 2017, 2018, which is a story in itself, which may well have evoked some sympathy among people on one level, but then that led to the decision maybe I should leave frontline politics and do something else, and that's when the ambassadorship came in. So I don't know whether I still suffer some form of PTSD from that period. I think sometimes when I get calls from journos, for example, asking for information, I often wonder, oh, this name's come up, are they after something on me? Because that's something I went through for 3 or 4 years pretty consistently, right? And so I don't think I fully understood the pressure I was under at the time, because my attitude has always been, and this was also the attitude with the cancer, was to get through every day. Yeah. What do I have to do to get through today?
Sure. Some fabulous learnings that, and for you, built enormous amount of courage and strength as a result of it.
Well, you never know what sort of a human being you'll be after. You know, there's a theory some people have that it can make you a stronger person, a better person. I just don't know, but the very act of surviving,
yes,
I think is obviously positive in itself, and building a certain stubborn optimism, for want of a better description.
The first example you used where ICAC, I think, was that about 2015, 2016?
It was about 2013, 2014.
Yeah, okay. So we scroll along 10 years, here we are today, and if a situation like that occurred today, do you think that the way in which you went about it then to manage it would, and tried to do that today, whether the dynamics in the marketplace would allow you to actually manage that because of social media and because of the change in the mindset of the broader population and the media and the tolerance or the lack of tolerance? Have you thought about that?
Yeah. 2 points on this. The first is, I would hope, having been through that experience, I'm better prepared to deal with what could come. And you're right, the context in which we do this is ever shifting and changing. So what may have been top of mind to people 10 years ago is not necessarily the same. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to go through it again, but if I had to, I have lessons from that period that I could apply again about how I conducted myself, how I conducted my own defence and whatever. The second point I would make is that I actually discussed this in a different context with a psychologist when I'd had the cancer treatment. And as part of the rehabilitation, we had some physical rehabilitation, and they also gave me a psychologist at St Vincent's for a few sessions to talk about how I was feeling having been through all of that. And one thing she said to me was, have you thought about what if the cancer recurs? I said, well, I don't like to think about it. And I said, what are you getting at? And the point she was making was, well, think about this. You've been through this experience now. You know what you faced. You know what you would face again. And perhaps you'll be better prepared for it because of what you've been through before and know what to do. And I think she was right that sometimes if you visualize your worst fear and can draw on how you maybe dealt with things like this before, that's something to hold on to. Again, not something I'd want to go through again, but she was really saying in a way that sometimes we dispel our worst fears by just facing up to them and facing through them. And in fact, I was talking to a lady here in Sydney who does some sort of, she's not a psychologist, she just does a bit of therapy for people. And a friend of mine had given me a voucher for this in return for me doing a talk somewhere. So I spoke with her and she said, well, look, when you're thinking about situations, just visualize, well, if this situation happened, how you would handle it, the way you would go through it and where you'd end up. Because she said in the end, everything has a practical set of steps that you can go through. And even if your worst fear is, for example, that you pass away and what's your family going to be like, think through how, in the end, they would have to cope. Think through how you could help potentially prepare them for that, have them in a better position for that. Just in a way, you empower yourself by taking ownership of the situation rather than allowing it to be a boogeyman that just sits out there.
Very much so.
If that makes sense.
No, because that's absolutely clear. Because if you can perceptualise that you can control what's going on around you, you feel empowered to actually own it and, as you say, control it.
Yeah.
Fascinating. In fact, when you were talking about the incident in 2013, 2014,
yeah.
I'd forgotten all about that.
Yeah.
And
people
I think
have largely forgotten.
Exactly, and that's my point. Is your ambassador Sinodinos? That's the way I think of you today.
Yeah.
And I think you've now moved on to the Asia group.
Yes.
And I think that one could perceive it as being the next stage in your career. Mm-hmm. How aligned in your mind are you in terms of branding, how do you sit in terms of positioning yourself and the Asia group? Are you seen as, are they separate entities? Are you an advisor to them? Is the organisation in its own right got its own branding? How does that operate? Because people in Australia wouldn't know too much about the Asia group. Mm. They know Arthur. Mm. How is that going to play out?
Just a short piece of history. The Asia Group was formed about 12 years ago by a lot of them ex-officials coming out of administrations in the US. Kurt Campbell was one of them, who's just finished up as Deputy Secretary of State, and in fact is coming back to the organisation. And their aim at that stage was to help American multinationals navigate Asia, policy and regulatory issues, geopolitical issues, identify market entry strategies, good local partners. This was a time when the US was more explicitly pivoting to the region. Since then, it's grown from being a DC-centric office to having offices throughout the region. Hong Kong, Shanghai, Mumbai, Delhi, Taipei, Tokyo, Hanoi, you go through a list, Bangkok in Thailand, Singapore, and now offices in Australia. And it helps countries or firms in the region that want to enter particular markets, or the sweet spot would be multinationals that have a footprint through the region. And it's business advisory work. Think of it as being at the junction of business and public policy and how the two interact and affect each other. And so in the Australian context, our priorities with Asia Group would be around defence and national security, particularly AUKUS, digital, because there's such interest in a lot of companies in doing digital stuff in Australia, but they know the regulations are pretty complex. And we're also now increasingly, post the Trump election, talking to companies that have interests, say, in North America, who may be impacted by the tariffs and other changes. So for me, that place was, first of all, comfortable in terms of the content of the work. It drew on a lot of stuff, economic, political, diplomatic, etc., that I dealt with before. Not a big organisation, 100 plus. It's about to double over the next few years. They've just had some growth capital. But it had a nice feel, a lot of young people in the organisation. So it had that sense of growth and developing into something beyond startup phase, but still in sort of expansion phase. I also liked the general sort of predisposition of the company, which was essentially in support of the US and its role in the region, and the importance of Asia, the Indo-Pacific, to the US. That's very much part of the ethos of the organisation, and I'm very comfortable with that, because particularly when I was ambassador, a lot of the work I was doing was about the Australia-America relationship in the context of how we work together, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, for our common security and other goals. And the company's sort of predisposition is around all of that. While we have clients in China, we look after foreign firms in China. We don't look after Chinese firms. And we're also not lobbyists per se. We have a lobbying organisation we can rely on in the US, but we don't sort of register as lobbyists per se. We're more like an extension of the corporate strategy of a firm. Government relations, public affairs, corporate affairs, and how we help them better cope with the environment they're in. And now with all the geopolitical flux that we're seeing in the world, companies like, or organisations like this, I think are all really trying to grapple with what does it mean in practical terms for businesses as they think about their supply chains, their labour forces, about the extent to which trade barriers, both tariff and non-tariff barriers, are going to be impacted by some of the changes we see with US policy.
Exactly. It's such a diverse area, and I guess there would be very few organisations of your ilk that cover the span of the globe.
And with a particular focus on and expertise in Asia. And the Indo-Pacific, really, because the India office is probably the biggest of the overseas offices, because of what Modi has done in terms of encouraging foreign direct investment into India, the focus on industrialisation and manufacturing. We do a lot of work with companies that want to be part of that story. So one of the other topics which I find fascinating, and certainly in public life, is when we talk about values and we talk about people's values. And I guess that's something that's very dear to you. When were values, when did they become important to you, or that you understood what they were all about? Yeah, it's a good question. I never studied philosophy, so I never looked at values through that context. For me, values rose up in practical situations. I can remember being at school and someone was being bullied, I forget, and I'd never had a fight with anyone, but I did intervene in this one. I was lucky at that stage because I was higher than average height before everybody else shot up above me, so I had an advantage, I think. But what I'm getting at is for me, values were situations where I feel strongly that someone is not being treated fairly or well, and that got me going. The other thing that got me going is when I knew people were peddling something that was blatantly false. We all live in a world where, we navigate the everyday, maybe with the odd white lie, but this is about bigger falsehoods than that. That really got me going. At the moment, what gets me going is the idea that great powers might be able to negotiate over the heads of smaller countries and determine their fates. That gets me going. I don't know how you classify that in terms of values, but for me, values are the times when I feel angry or concerned that something wrong has happened and I want to intervene or at least call it out.
Oppression and things of that nature,
Yeah.
probably. So, in your career in politics, it must have been really challenging at times to steer accordingly. Were there ever any instances where you literally had to walk away, or your values were compromised to the point that you just couldn't move?
It's a good question. I mean, the fundamental thing about party politics is that when you sign up, you have to accept that there will be times when you don't agree with party policy, but you've signed up to be part of this brand, this party. Mm-hmm. So you'll win on some, you'll lose on some, but if the overall effort is a good effort to be part of, then you have to accept that. And I'm not saying that means you compromise fundamental values like honesty or integrity or whatever, but you have to accept that a party will not always do everything the way you would do it. You then have to make a judgment what you are prepared to live with. And I've never, to be honest, in politics, found a situation where I felt compromised by that. There have been situations where, I'll give you an example. When Tony Abbott became leader of the opposition after Malcolm Turnbull fell over, I mean, I'd been a supporter of what Malcolm was doing on the carbon pollution reduction scheme with the then government, because in the Howard government, we'd also pushed an emissions trading scheme or whatever. Tony came in, he was dead against the carbon tax per se. He did develop an alternative. The way I rationalised it to myself is it was clear the public were not going to cop anything that looked ultimately like a carbon tax, because particularly in that period, 2009, 2010, the cost of living was starting to become back as an issue. So in my mind, I rationalised that, well, maybe taking an approach like the ultimate emissions reduction scheme that we put in place when we came into government was maybe something more palatable to the public than trying to impose a carbon price. Even though in my own mind as an economist, I thought a carbon price in a vacuum is probably the best way to get the reallocation you need. So there were situations where I would rationalise things to myself, but I think I had good reasons to do that. And I go back to my basic point. If you become a party politician, you have to accept they're not going to do everything that you want. I mean, Penny Wong's another example where for years she was clearly in favour of same-sex marriage, but the party platform about a decade or so ago for the Labor Party was not in favour of that. And she had to work internally to get that changed, as we all work internally, but she had to toe the party line. We all have to toe the party line. That's where I think the issue of compromise comes in.
So that's compromise on policy, and I may sort of deviate slightly
Yes.
when we talk about values in terms of, you know, if people are not respecting each other and treating each other the way one would believe, and we've seen instances in the last so many years with that occurring in, that's something difficult to live with. You'd concur with that?
Yeah. But I found in politics, most of the time, I was pretty straight up and down with people, even during leadership situations.
Someone said to me the other day when I said to them that I was going to be interviewed, they never forget that when you were not so well, you came in to participate in the vote. Well, and that's standing up for what you believe, and that's critically important.
And it was personal as well, in the sense that this was when Malcolm Turnbull was walking down the corridor about to lose his job. It was because I felt like he had stood by me in some difficult situations in my life, when I'd had to stand down or when I'd been sick. So I felt it was almost like a personal thing, not just a political thing.
Understand. But I was talking more personal than political, and I think that's a testament to your values and your authenticity. When you've moved into different countries to operate, the values and the approach to doing business is very different. How do you rationalise that? So, for example, the US is probably in some ways close to our way of doing business, our politics in terms of not the structure, but in terms of interaction. But if you move into the Asian psyche, they have a different way of doing it. How have you been able to manage that sort of situation?
I mean, I don't do as much directly in Asian countries, but I've got experience of Asia over the years. And I think the mindset you've got to take is if you have a new customer or client, how do they try and see the world as they see it? Can you put yourself in their shoes? In the case of the Americans, the best approach, I think, is always to be upfront, to be quite clear about what you're about, what you want. They'll respect that.
Yeah.
Some people sometimes say we're divided by a common language in the sense that sometimes they don't get our sense of humour and we don't get theirs in some ways. But I found on the whole that they like Australians, they respect Australians, and that gives us a big head start, if you like, in doing business. And they see us as sharing a set of interests and values. Now, that may be tested as we go forward, given that America is changing its outlook on the world. But most Americans have a very good view of Australia. I remember that when I first got to America, it was just after the bushfires in Australia. Every American seemed to be aware of the bushfires, was asking me about them. So I think Australians in the US walk through the door and they're regarded in quite a different way to perhaps some other countries. And that, I think, is helpful. But then you've got to prove yourself. But that's the great thing about the US. There's just this feeling that things can get done.
Exactly right. It is quite a different mindset to what we have in Australia.
Nothing is impossible.
No.
And it's funny, whatever side of politics in the US, and I remember a John F. Kennedy quote, about going to the moon. He said, "We're not doing this because it's easy. We're doing this because it's hard."
It's hard, exactly. Yeah, no, but it's so true. It's
Yeah.
so true. If we talk about relevance, you mentioned it earlier,
Yeah.
and recognition. Do you see a difference in the you're well recognised? How do you maintain your relevance in the way in which you operate? Because you talk about the Asia group has got a lot of young people, etc. I'm very conscious of the fact that organisations in which I am involved, I want to see a lot of young people because that's the succession and the way in which you actually grow.
Yeah.
But by the same token, as an individual, you obviously want to maintain your relevance in being able to add value. Is it something you've spent time thinking about?
Most of my career sort of just happened rather than me planning it. In this latest iteration, what's happened, because I straddled the US and Australia, the nature of what's been happening between the two countries, framed by the contest between the US and China, has sort of given me a strategic context in which to operate that helps with this relevance piece. And the election of Trump in the United States and the big policy changes he's engineering has added to that demand from people to know what's going on, particularly here in Australia, and how does it impact Australia. I'm talking at a Australia-Canada Leadership Forum in the next little while. They're interested in how Canada is handling Trump versus how Australia is handling Trump. So that relevance piece is sort of, in one sense at the moment, taking care of itself because people are interested in what's going on, and they're interested in people like me who've had the benefit of living and working in the US, but who are Australian and who sort of understand the Australian context and can relate one to the other.
Interesting. That certainly leads me to the perspective of good leadership. You mentioned earlier that you've worked for some outstanding leaders and advised outstanding leaders. What is your leadership style?
I think the first part of it is an open door, and that the open door is a metaphor, but it's also physical. An open door so people feel they can come in and out. Metaphorical in the sense of an open communication style where possible. Err on the side of sharing information rather than keeping it to yourself, unless it's something secret that has to be kept secret. Being able to trust people, not just with information, but to do their jobs, not micromanage. Clear roles and responsibilities of people, and then people are held accountable for that. So my role in the Prime Minister's office over time evolved very much into almost a HR role where not just in the Prime Minister's office, but across government, we were wanting to make sure we had the right advisors in the right positions at the right time. Looking after people who may have been displaced by ministerial reshuffles and the rest. No one left behind. We either found them a job inside or outside to send a signal that we were a team. It was funny with the open door style. I can remember, because I had a big couch in my room, a bit like this. Someone had come in to talk about something, like one of the press secs, and then one of the other advisors might come in, and then before you knew it, you had 4 or 5 people in there having a whole discussion. And while that discussion in itself may not have led to a particular outcome, the fact that people were in there talking, letting off steam, making observations, just that feeling that they could contribute ideas, exchange ideas, I think was very, very important. I've been in situations where I've had to fire people, and that's not easy for anybody, but it's had to be done. And I've tried to handle that as sensitively as I can. I learned from John Howard in that regard. His attitude to cabinet reshuffles was he'd tell the people who were losing their jobs first and then tell the winners. And with the losers, he would spend the time to talk to them, explain what and why, and potentially whether there was a soft landing for them. What I admired about his style was that he eyeballed people. He wasn't afraid. Some other leaders, sometimes, you'd find out through the press you're about to lose your job. That was not his style. That was not how he treated people. And, when you talk about values, one of the values I really took away from my relationship with him was the way he treated everybody, the courteous way he treated people. The old adage about, be nice to people on the way up, you'll meet them on the way down. But he was nice to people in all walks of life. And while on one level you could say, oh, he's a politician, he's got to be nice. No, even in situations where it wasn't public or whatever, he took a respectful, well-mannered attitude to people. He was that old-fashioned term, a gentleman.
Very much so, and still is.
And still is, absolutely.
So in your leadership style, what about the values you espouse? How do you articulate that and how do you embed it in your teams?
I think it's leadership by example. Being able to show people you're not asking them to do things you won't do yourself. If you value honesty and integrity, you also have to role model those in yourself. People will judge you not so much by what you say, but by what you do and by how you handle them as well. And whether it's being an ambassador, a minister, or a chief of staff, you're a bit like a role model. Someone said to me once when I was ambassador, you're a spectacle. I said, does that mean I'm a circus act or what do you mean? He said, no, you're on show 24/7. And you've got to act accordingly. Goes back a bit to your earlier point about, how you put on the identity and whatever. But the reality is in those roles, you have to be able to demonstrate the very values, the very things you want them to have as well.
Very much so. And in fact, this podcast, the name has changed to Astute Leadership. And astute leaders fulfill a role in the position they hold. And the way they articulate it, the skills, the style they operate, all of the components. And you as an ambassador, I believe, fulfilled that to the nth degree. And to the point that people still think of you as the ambassador.
Well, of course, Garry, in the US, they love to call people by their titles. If you're a retired senator, they still call you senator, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same with ambassador. Whereas if you go around Australia saying, ambassador, I'm Ambassador X, they say, what a tosser, that was his last job, Come on, get real. Which is, in many ways, a refreshing thing about Australia.
Exactly. They bring you right down to earth very quickly, don't they? Very absolutely. Grounded, as we say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very grounded. You've had the opportunity of meeting many younger people and guiding them and advising them. Is there anyone or a number of people who have mentored you and helped you through your career and stages in in life?
I've never had formal mentors, but there are people who I've learned from. John Howard was one of them, and I've probably absorbed more from him than I even know by a process of just being with him. I would say he was the principal one I've learned from because it was a long association and quite a close association. I've worked with other leaders. I've worked with Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison, learned different things from different people. In terms of other more personal mentors, I mean, obviously my father was very important to me growing up, but in terms of my professional life, Ted Evans in Treasury, he wasn't a formal mentor, but I loved the way Ted carried himself. I loved the way he understood economics and could relate it to the issues of the day. And he had a certain policy integrity around him. And the other guy there from my Treasury days who, well, there's a couple that I remember very well. David Morgan, who went on to be CEO of Westpac, and he was a great role model. Just someone he was very intense, very hardworking, but again, someone who I thought led by example. And then the other guy was someone who became a Deputy Secretary in Treasury, Mike Callaghan, who became the go-to person for government around superannuation and everything. He had a more quiet leadership style, but just what I found interesting about him was you brought him a problem, and he was never one of these people who say, "Oh, what's going on? How are we going to fix this?" He would just sit down calmly and look at it. And once he was calm, you would calm down because you realise, well, okay, he's got a sense of certainty about him that we'll find a way through. I found it very admirable. And again, a person with loads of integrity.
In your ambassador role, was there anyone within that environment that you worked with that you felt gave you good advice and direction? Or is it more in the Australian sort of psyche? I mean, obviously it's a foreign environment, so yes. Trying to build relationships is always a bit more challenging.
I mean, two of the ambassadors I worked with, Karen Pearce from the UK, thorough professional, and Rosemary Banks from New Zealand, again, a thorough professional. I found they were great sources of advice on doing things in the US. And then in the US system, the person who stood out for me was Kurt Campbell. Mm-hmm. And he was Indo-Pacific coordinator at the White House and then Deputy Secretary of State. What I loved about Kurt and love about Kurt still is he was not just a great brain, but he was one of these people who was genuinely committed to America in the Indo-Pacific. And he was such a driver of policy in the US system around AUKUS, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, Partners of the Blue Pacific, a whole slew of things that we did together. For me, it was a great event, the Quad leaders meetings. For me, it was a great adventure because I felt that we had a partner in the White House and then the State Department committed to the region who had the clout to push things through. And of course, the US system is so large and cumbersome, but he could push things through. And they were all things that were meant to create a better environment in the region and one which put cooperation with allies and partners at the front, at the forefront of what he was doing. So I found him, he's still a very admirable figure in my view and made a great contribution to our relationship, Australia, America. He stood out for me in Washington in my time there.
And as you said earlier, he's joined your...
He's rejoined, yes.
The Asia
was
Group.
One of the founders, yeah.
Terrific.
Yeah.
We could talk all day about your experiences and your career.
You're a very smooth interviewer.
But there's so much knowledge and experience and expertise. What would be your advice to young people who are just starting out, who don't really know what their career is going to be? They have great ambition, but they don't necessarily have a path. What's some advice and some of your wisdom that you could share with us today?
Well, I'm grappling with this issue with my oldest son. He's doing a degree at Catholic University in Communications and Media, but he's done a couple of semesters at Oxford in British History and Politics. And so he's thinking about next steps, whether he does something postgraduate or whatever. My main advice to young people is don't be afraid to take risks. You'll regret later the risks you didn't take. Of course, you've got to take measured risks, but don't be afraid to do things when you're young and try things out, because nothing is irreversible in that sense. And, touch wood, with the longevity of people today, you have more time to make up for any mistakes or whatever. But try new things. And also, today, compared with, say, my time, I would encourage people to think more about being entrepreneurs, about having their own business. I think it suits the temper of the times. More people want to work for themselves, be their own boss. I think when you're young, unattached, is probably the best time to give it a go. And sure, that may mean you work hard at long hours, but gee, there can be some great rewards. And partly my thinking has been influenced by my exposure to the US, particularly living there the last 4 or 5 years, where I saw that Americans, to our point before, weren't going to take no for an answer. So, for example, with COVID, to the credit of the then administration, the Trump administration, their attitude was, well, we're not just going to sit here and cop it. We're going to do Operation Warp Speed, and we're going to find vaccines, and we're going to find them quickly. And they mobilised the federal government to do that, and they succeeded, and even grew new companies like Moderna out of the process. So my point to young people is have a go. And if that involves having a go at a startup, entrepreneurship, by all means, do it. I think the other thing in today's world, and this is again something that goes to my values in inverted commas, is while nationalism is important, we're all proud to be Australians, proud to be Americans, there's a fundamental kinship, brotherhood of people around the world, right? We're all fundamentally human. And to sort of borrow a phrase from John Howard, the things that unite us are greater than things that divide us. And I think sometimes we've got to think about that more, rather than thinking that there's some hierarchy of consideration and that people somewhere abroad aren't worthy of as much consideration. I'm conscious that, we have these issues today around illegal immigration and other things, but we got to find a way to work together. We're all human beings in the end.
Absolutely. And we're on this earth for a one time. We should make it a good time and enjoy each other's company and enjoy the wonderful country we have here.
Absolutely.
We have so much to offer. Arthur, as I said earlier, we could talk for the rest of the day because the stories you have and your experience is amazing. I just want to say it's been an absolute privilege and a pleasure to spend time to chat to you, and I thank you very much for sharing everything that you have today.
No, thank you, Garry, for the opportunity. And look, what you do through this podcast, I'm sure there are many lives that are affected positively by your gentle and prodding approach to people.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
You. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a 5-star review and subscribe for more episodes. And if you'd like to learn more about developing your personal brand, please visit garrybrowne.com.au to get in touch or grab a copy of Brand New, Brand You.